I'm Karl Kost, and my presentation will be about artificial neural networks. This is the agenda. I will start with some history related to uh, artificial neural networks. Then I will go through some of most important concepts related to this area. The history of neural networks is longer than most people think. While the idea of machine that thinks can be traced to the ancient Greeks, the history of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and neural networks is traced back to the Second World War. In 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts published a paper called "A Logical Calculus of the Idea Immanent in Nervous Activity." This research analyzes how the human brain could produce complex patterns through connected brain cells or neurons. One of the main ideas that came out of this work was the comparison of neurons with a binary threshold to Boolean logic 0, 1. Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts were researchers from the University of Chicago. But in 1952, they moved to MIT and were the founding members of what may be called the first cognitive science department. Neural networks were a major area of research in both neuroscience and computer science until 1969. In 1968, the first trainable neural network, the perceptron, was demonstrated by a psychologist from the University of Cornell. It is Frank Rosenblatt, and Frank Rosenblatt is credited with the development of perceptron and documented his research in the perceptron, a probabilistic model for information storage and organization in the brain. He took from McCulloch and Pitt's work a step further by introducing weights to the equation. Leveraging an IBM 704, Rosenblatt was able to get a computer to learn how to distinguish cars marked on the left versus cars marked on the right. In 1970, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert became co-directors of the new MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Wrote a book with Seymour Papert, and this book it was called Perceptron, and it was published in 1969, and it attacked the work of Frank Rosenblatt. The book is the center of a controversy in the history of artificial intelligence, and some claims that to have had a great importance in the discouraging the research of neural networks, mainly in the 1970s, and it contributed to what it is called the AI winter. But in 1974, while many researchers contributed to the idea of backpropagation, Paul Werbus was the first person in the United States to note its application within neural networks, and he published it in his PhD thesis. In 1989, Yann LeCun published a paper illustrating how the use of constraints in backpropagation and its integration into the neural networks architecture, and how it can be used to train algorithms. This research successfully leveraged a neural network to recognize handwriting zip code digits provided by the US Postal Service. Neural networks reflect the behavior of human brain, allowing computer programs to recognize patterns and solve common problems in the field of AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Neural networks are also known as artificial intelligence networks or simulated neural networks. Neural networks are a subset of machine learning and are the heart of deep learning algorithms. Their name and structure are inspired in the human brain, and it mimics the way that biological neurons sign to one another. Artificial neural networks are comprised of node layers containing an input layer, one or more hidden layers, and an output layer. Each node or artificial neuron connects to another and has an associated weight and threshold. If the output of any individual node is above the specific threshold value, that node is activated, sending data to the next layer of the network. Otherwise, no data is passed along the next layer of the network. Think of each individual node as its own linear regression model, composed of input data, weights, a bias or threshold, and an output. The formula would look something like this. Once an input layer is determined, weights are assigned. These weights help determine the importance of any given variable, with larger ones contributing more significantly to the output compared to the other inputs. All inputs are then multiplied by their respective weights and then summed. Afterward, the output is passed through an activation function, which determines the output. If that output exceeds a given threshold, it fires or activates the node, passing data to the next layer in the network. This results in output of one node becoming the input of the next node. This process of passing data from one layer to the next layer defines this neural network as a feed-forward network. We may think about a more practical use case for neural networks like image recognition or classification. We may use the supervised learning or level datasets to train the algorithms. As we train the model, we'll want to evaluate its accuracy using a cost or loss function. This is also commonly referred to as the square error, MSE. In that equation, as you may see, I represent the index of the sample, y hat is the predicted output, y is the actual value, and m is the number of samples. Ultimately, the goal it is to minimize our cost function to ensure correctness or fit for any given observation. As the model adjusts its weights and bias, it uses the cost function and the reinforcement learning to reach the point of convergence or the local minimum. The process in which the algorithm adjusts its weights is through gradient descendant. It allows the model to determine the direction to take to reduce errors or minimize the cost function. With each training example, the parameters of the model adjust to gradually converge at the minimum. Most deep neural networks are feed-forward, meaning they flow in one direction only, from input to output. However, we can also train our model through backpropagation, that is, model in the opposite direction from output to input. Backpropagation allows us to calculate and attribute the error associated with each neuron, allowing us to adjust and fit the parameters of the models appropriately. Neural networks can be classified into different types, which are used for different purposes. The perceptron is the oldest neural network created by Frank Rosenblatt in 1958, and it has a single neuron, and it is the simplest form of neural networks. This is another representation of a perceptron. A perceptron is a neural network without any hidden layer. A perceptron only has an input layer and an output layer. Feed-forward neural networks or multi-layer perceptrons, MLPs, are what we have primarily been focusing here. They are comprised of an input layer, an hidden layer or layers, and the output layer. While these neural networks are also commonly referred as MLPs, it's important to note that they are actually comprised of sigmoid neurons, not perceptrons, as most real-world problems are nonlinear. Data usually is fed into these models to train them, and they are the foundations for example, computer vision, natural language processing, and other type of neural networks. A neural network executes in two steps: feed forward and backpropagation. On a feed-forward neural network, we have a set of input features and some random weights. Notice that in this case, we are taking random weights that will optimize using backward propagation. During backpropagation, we calculate the error between predicted output and target output, and then we use an algorithm, the gradient descendant, to update the weight values. Why do we need backpropagation? While designing a neural network, first we need to train a model and assign specific weights to each of those inputs. That weights decides how essential it is, that feature, for our prediction. The higher the weights, the greater the importance. However, uh, initially we do not know the specific weights required by those inputs. So that we do is we assign some random weight to our inputs, and our model calculated the error in prediction. So we update our weights values and return the code backpropagation. After individual iteration, we can get lower errors values and higher accuracy. Convolutional neural networks, or CNN, are similar to feed-forward networks, but they are usually used for image recognition, pattern recognition, and/or computer vision. These networks harness principles from linear algebra, particularly matrix multiplication, to identify patterns within an image. Convolutional neural networks have wide application in image and video recognition, and for example, also recommendation systems. Recurrent neural networks are identified by their feedback loops. These learning algorithms are primarily leveraged when using time series data to make predictions about future outcomes such as stock market predictions or sales forecasts. A neural network is a supervised learning algorithm, which means that we provide it with the input data containing the independent variable and the output data that contains the dependent variable. For instance, in our example, our independent variable, maybe for example, smoke, obesity, and exercise. The dependent variable maybe a person diabetic or not. So it is a classification example. This is the example that I have presented previously. The features are obesity, smoking habits, and exercise habits for a specific number of people. And the target, it is information if a person it is diabetic or not. Here we define the hyperparameters for our neural network. We use the random seed function so that we can get the same random values whenever the script is executed. And we initialize our weights with normally distributed random numbers. We need to define our activation function and its derivative. The activation function of a node defines the output of that node given an input or set of inputs. And the method that calculates the derivative of the sigmoid function is defined as follows. The derivative of the sigmoid function is simply sigmoid x multiplying by sigmoid 1 minus x. Now we are ready to train our neural network that will be able to predict whether a person is diabetic or not. In the first step, we define the number of epochs. An epoch is basically the number of times we want to train the algorithm on our data. We will train the algorithm on our data 20,000 times. We have tested this number and found that the error is pretty much minimized after 20,000 iterations. Then you can try with different number, obviously, and find out what it is the error. Next, we store the value from the feature set to the input variable. Here we find that the dot product of the input and the weighted vector and add bias to it. This is step 1 of the feedforward section. We pass the dot product through sigmoid activation function as in step 2 of the feedforward section. This completes the feed-forward part of our algorithm. Now is the time to start backpropagation. The variable x contains the predicted output. The first step of the backpropagation is to find the error. The first step in the backpropagation section is to find the cost of the predictions. The cost of predictions can simply be calculated by finding the difference between the predicted output and the actual output. We then print the error on the screen. Backpropagation. Step 2, minimize the cost. In order to minimize the cost, we need to find the weight and bias values for which the cost function returns the smallest value possible. The smaller the cost, the more correct our predictions are. We need to differentiate the function with respect to each weight. We will use the chain rule differentiation for this purpose. We can now try and predict the value of a single instance. Let's suppose that we have a record of a patient that comes in and it smokes, is not obese, and does not exercise. Let's find if it is likely to be diabetic or not. The input feature will look like this: 1, 0, 0, 0. And the result, it is almost close to 0. And thank you for your attention.